Good morning and welcome in the name of Christ. We're so glad that you've joined us for this morning's message. Today we are drawing from the book of Matthew, chapter 15, verses 10 through 20. There's something I would like you to think about today. What is your basis for discerning what is right and what is wrong? What has created the parameters for how you make that decision? In our lesson today, Jesus is having a debate with some Pharisees about ritual cleanliness. When the Pharisees talk about washing hands before they eat, it's not about personal hygiene. It is merely a religious ritual that they observe. I don't want anyone to get the idea that Jesus is suggesting that it is not important to wash one's hands before eating or any other thing that we do. Again, Jesus' answer is not about personal hygiene. Rather, it pertains to a ritualistic practice followed by the Pharisees so that they will be considered ceremonially clean before they eat. Jesus wants to be sure that the people are not drawn into the legalistic arguments of the Pharisees and wants them to be able to tell the difference between what causes a person to be defiled and it's not about someone forgetting to wash their hands. What Jesus says is that it really all boils down to our attitudes and our core principles. It is not eating with unclean hands or anything that we eat or drink that causes us to sin, but rather that which comes from inside of us, as Jesus says, from the heart, from our thoughts. It really boils down to our attitudes and principles and how we determine what is right and what is wrong. As I look around our society today, I really wonder how many people out there even think in terms of right and wrong anymore, Christians included. Are there certain behaviors that we refuse to tolerate or will not engage in, that we point to and say without a doubt, that is wrong? I have had conversations with several people lately who were obviously frustrated about this. One person said that they were almost afraid to say anything to anyone in this current political climate. They claim that they're almost scared to point out any kind of behavior, no matter how depraved or perverse that it is, and call it wrong, because of how some people will react to it if they do. It seems like so many people today are paralyzed with an overdose of tolerance, and we are drowning in political correctness and moral relativism. So what is a good Christian to do? The image the Bible gives to us of Jesus Christ is that he was the most loving and accepting person who has ever lived. Jesus never met a stranger or refused to associate with anyone, even in spite of the fact that he knew it would anger the good church people of his day, and especially the pious Pharisees. He ate with sinners and people who were tax collectors for the Roman government. He welcomed the poor and those with terrible diseases. But at the same time, he never let anyone get away from him without being sure they understood what was right and what was wrong. While Jesus upheld the rules that had come from God, he also fought against the legalistic attitudes of the Pharisees and the way they sought to impose the rules they made on others. We see an example of this later on in Matthew, in chapter 23, a section often called the Seven Woes. Jesus chastises the Pharisees for their hypocrisy and lack of compassion for the poor. When the crowds gather to hear him speak in the temple, Jesus warns them not to follow the example of the Pharisees by saying, "They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for men to see." All during his ministry, Jesus pointed to the great wrongs that existed in his day and the need to promote justice. Jesus stated plainly, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." I remember a paper my kids once brought home from Sunday school to help them tell the difference between right and wrong. It read, Anything that breaks one of God's laws is wrong. And anything that goes against what God is like is wrong. Now, this seems very straightforward and simple enough, doesn't it? So then, why is it that so many of us feel stuck in an endless wasteland of gray areas? Today it seems like the concepts of right and wrong are just labels that are often dismissed as insignificant or irrelevant, and even mocked by some. In our American culture, there has been an encroachment of Eastern philosophy and thinking. Practices like yoga and meditation have become commonplace. Eastern philosophical concepts like the belief that something can be both true and false at the same time have come to be accepted by many people. Graham Priest is one philosopher I have read who has endorsed this view. But there are other philosophers, such as Alan Thomas, who dismiss this kind of thinking as total nonsense. He states, "If you believe that, you'll believe anything." But the sad state of things is that this seems to be where we are in America today. We are a culture that believes anything and everything, and a culture that believes anything and everything is standing on the brink of believing in nothing. Many Christians today believe that we are at a critical moment in time, and that the church needs to find its backbone and step up and be heard. As the church, we need to reestablish some basic categories of right and wrong, and as the people of the church, we need to find our public voice. I remember a number of years ago reading a book called How Could You Do That? By Dr. Laura Schlesinger, who was a longtime host for a call-in radio program. She begins her book by stating, "The path to solid, supportive, healthy relationships, self-respect, and a quality life starts with the usually painful decision to do the right thing." This is the book to get you on the path and keep you focused on those goals. In her book, she also states, the main thrust of far too many lives is an overemphasis on feeling good instead of doing good. Being admired and respected by the self and others has taken a backseat to feeling good, or at least avoiding feeling bad. She also argues that our society must get back to some basic beliefs about right and wrong, and that we must have boundaries for our conduct. She says that we must get back to practicing the 3 C's: character, courage, and conscience. Even though Schlesinger's book was written over 20 years ago now, it seems little has changed in our society, and many would argue that the moral relativism that is so pervasive in our society today is even worse now than it was back then. Schlesinger's book is a good read, and I would recommend it to anyone. However, the book we really need to read that will help us to keep our focus on doing good instead of just doing the things that help us to just feel good is the one that we already should have. It's the Bible. Lately, there have been many highly educated people that have been putting forth this idea that there are no such things as absolutes. Everything is relative, and everything is dependent on the circumstances one finds themselves in. Therefore, no behavior can be labeled as empirically wrong. It seems these days that the language of absolutes absolutely terrifies many people in our culture, and with good reason. If the church would just begin to speak out and proclaim that there are some unbendable rules about right and wrong, there would soon be an outcry against that kind of thinking, and there would be people who would take offense that we would dare make such a claim. But as Jesus makes clear in today's text, the moment you take a stand on a principle, you will be met with opposition. And the moment you say no more and draw a moral line in the sand, you will make enemies. I believe it's time for the church to step up and be heard. For far too long now, we Christians have avoided discussing the notion that categories like right and wrong even exist. But the truth is that they were designed by God to help us to develop good character and to keep us from harming ourselves and from harming one another. One of the reasons that the church has lost its standing in our society is that for far too long it has not taken a stand on much of anything. And by trying to play amidst the ever-shifting sands of cultural popularity and moral relativism, the church has lost its credibility, which has made it easy for our enemies to label us as no longer even relative. Author and theologian Glenn T. Miller once stated, "The church's attempt to shape public life has failed. Instead of the church creating a more just world, the church has created a less religious and far less meaningful church." As Christians, we are supposed to be shaping the culture, but instead we have passively stood by and let the culture shape us. It's high time that we, as Christians, take a stand and say, enough. In Genesis chapter 4, we read that God accepts Abel's sacrifice and offers him praise. We also read that Cain feels slighted because God did not accept his offering. And God says to Cain, "Why are you angry?" The Lord asked him. "Why is your face so dark with rage? It can be bright with joy if you will do what you should. But if you refuse to obey, watch out. Sin is waiting to attack you, longing to destroy you, but you can conquer it." Genesis chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. Dr. Schlesinger's commentary on this passage is this: "It seems to me that God is teaching us that joy comes from doing right, in spite of the reaction from or input by others, including God. Just like Cain, we have a choice. Sin is always lurking at our door as well, waiting to catch us at a weak moment. But always remember, Cain had a choice. He could have chosen to do what was right, but instead we know that he chose to do what was wrong." Abraham Lincoln once observed, "It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. We need to be sure we are choosing to do what is right. The Bible is our guide." And I also really like Schlesinger's 3 C's: character, courage, and conscience. God has carefully laid out for us in the Bible what we need to know in order to do what is right. And then we need to focus on doing good instead of just doing the things that make us feel good, so that we may represent Christ well, and so that we may be salt and light. Amen.